The last rays of the setting sun painted the crumbling mining town of Silverdale in shades of gold and crimson, as Tabitha Sullivan stood outside her small cabin, clutching the eviction notice with trembling hands. The Silverdale silver mine had been the lifeblood of the community for over 20 years, and its sudden closure 2 weeks prior had left the entire town reeling. But for Tabitha, a 23-year-old who had already endured more than her fair share of hardship, the mine's closure was nothing short of catastrophic. The year was 1878, and the American West was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Women without husbands or families had few options, especially in a dying mining town where hope was draining away faster than water in the desert heat. 3 days, Tabitha whispered to herself, her voice catching as she stared at the paper. 3 days to leave the only home I've known since Pa died. The cabin, humble as it was, represented everything she had left in the world. Her father had been one of the first miners in Silverdale, building this small dwelling with his own hands. After pneumonia had taken him 5 years ago, Tabitha had managed to keep it by working as the mine's bookkeeper. It was one of the few respectable positions available to a young, unmarried woman, and she had been grateful for it. Now the mine owners had not only closed operations without warning, but had also decided to sell all the company-owned land, including the plots where miners' cabins stood. The new owners wanted everyone out, planning to tear down the entire settlement and use the land for cattle grazing. "Miss Sullivan," a voice called from down the dirt road. Tabitha quickly wiped away a tear before turning to see Mrs. Gladwell, the general store owner's wife, approaching with a small basket. "I brought you some bread and preserves," the older woman said, her own eyes rimmed with red. "Walter and I are leaving for Denver tomorrow. Our son has offered us a place to stay until Walter can find work." "That's very kind of you," Tabitha said, accepting the basket. "I wish you safe travels." "What about you, dear? Have you made any arrangements?" Tabitha forced a smile. "Not yet, but I'm considering my options." The truth was, she had no options. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and she had neither horse nor wagon to get there. The stagecoach fare would cost nearly every cent she had saved, leaving her nothing to live on once she arrived. And what then? Another mining town that could close just as suddenly. A position as a maid or laundress, working from dawn till dusk for mere pennies. "Well, don't wait too long," Mrs. Gladwell cautioned. "Almost everyone is gone or leaving. It's not safe for a young woman to be alone out here." After Mrs. Gladwell departed, Tabitha returned to her cabin and lit a lamp. The small space that had once felt so cozy now seemed to mock her with memories of better days. Her father's old mining tools still hung on one wall. His rocking chair sat empty by the fireplace. On the table lay the ledger where she had kept the mine's accounts with meticulous precision, a skill her father had insisted she learn, saying education was something no one could take from her. How wrong he had been. They had taken everything else, her home, her livelihood, her security. As night fell completely, Tabitha sat at the table and began to write letters by lamplight. One to her mother's cousin in Boston, whom she'd never met but who was her only known relative. One to the school teacher in Preston, the next town over, inquiring about any positions. She had no idea if either letter would bring any response, but she had to try something. Dawn brought no relief from her worries. Tabitha rose early, as was her habit, and stepped outside to fetch water from the well. The town was eerily quiet. Where once there would have been miners heading to their shifts, children playing, and women hanging laundry, now there were only abandoned cabins and the occasional wagon loaded with a family's possessions heading out of town. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice the rider approaching until the horse's hooves were almost upon her. Startled, she looked up to see a tall man on a chestnut stallion, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Morning, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and held the slight drawl of someone from Texas or perhaps Louisiana. "Seems like I've arrived in town at an inopportune time." "There's no opportune time to arrive in Silverdale anymore," Tabitha replied, setting down her water bucket. "The mine's closed, town's dying." The stranger dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so. His face was tanned and weathered from the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "Keller Dawson," he introduced himself, extending a hand. Tabitha hesitated before taking it. His grip was firm but gentle. "Tabitha Sullivan." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Sullivan. I was hoping to speak with someone about purchasing land hereabouts. I've been looking to establish a cattle operation." A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "Well, Mr. Dawson, you're in luck. The entire town is for sale. The mining company sold everything to some cattle baron from Wyoming. We all have to be out in 3 days." Keller Dawson's brow furrowed. "Whitmore, Edward Whitmore. That's the name on my eviction notice," Tabitha confirmed. "Well, that's a stroke of luck then. I've been working as foreman on Whitmore's main ranch for the past 5 years. I'm here on his behalf to assess the property and begin planning the conversion to grazing land." Tabitha felt her face flush with anger. "So you're the one who's going to tear down our homes?" Keller had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I didn't know people were still living here. Mr. Whitmore told me the town was abandoned after the mine closed." "Well, he lied," Tabitha said sharply. "There are still at least 10 families trying to figure out where to go, including me." Keller removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I'm truly sorry about that, Miss Sullivan. It wasn't my intention to displace anyone." "Your intention doesn't change my situation, Mr. Dawson." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Keller glanced around at the mostly abandoned town, then back at Tabitha's small cabin. "You live alone?" he asked. "My father died 5 years ago," she replied stiffly. "I was the mine's bookkeeper until they closed without warning 2 weeks ago." Keller nodded thoughtfully. "A bookkeeper, you say? That's a valuable skill." "Not valuable enough to keep a roof over my head, apparently." He ran a hand through his hair, seeming to come to a decision. "Miss Sullivan, I have a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it." Tabitha crossed her arms, suspicious, but with few enough options that she couldn't afford to dismiss any potential solution. "I'm listening. I've been saving to buy my own spread for years. 6 months ago, I purchased 1,000 acres about 20 miles north of here. Good land with a creek running through it. I've built a cabin and some basic outbuildings, but I haven't officially moved there yet because I'm still fulfilling my contract with Whitmore." "What does this have to do with me?" Tabitha asked. "I need someone to help establish the ranch while I finish my time with Whitmore, someone who can keep accounts, manage supplies, and oversee the hiring of a couple of hands. The previous owner left some cattle, and I've purchased more that will be delivered next month." Tabitha stared at him, trying to determine if he was serious. "You want to hire me, a woman you just met?" "I need someone trustworthy and capable. You need somewhere to go," he shrugged. "It seems like a potential solution for both of us." "And what would prevent you from dismissing me once you no longer need my services?" Tabitha asked, unwilling to trade one precarious situation for another. Keller's expression grew serious. "I'd draw up a proper contract. 1 year guaranteed employment with room and board, with the option to extend if the arrangement works for both of us." It was a generous offer, more generous than Tabitha had any right to expect from a stranger. Too generous, perhaps. "What's the catch, Mr. Dawson?" A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "The catch is that the cabin is rustic at best, the work will be hard, and your only company for much of the time will be cattle and a couple of ranch hands I've yet to hire." "And you," Tabitha pointed out. "Actually, no. I'll be staying at Whitmore's main ranch until my contract ends in 3 months. I'd only be able to visit the property occasionally until then." Tabitha's mind raced. The offer provided a solution to her immediate problem of having nowhere to go, but it also meant trusting a man she'd just met and moving to an isolated property. I'd need to see this ranch before making any decision, she said cautiously. Keller nodded. Of course. I can take you there today if you'd like. Today? Tabitha hesitated. I have preparations to make if I'm to leave here. Time is short, Miss Sullivan. If you're interested, we should go now so you can decide and still have time to pack your belongings before the eviction. Tabitha looked back at her small cabin. What choice did she really have? The letters she'd written might never receive replies, and even if they did, it would be too late. Very well, Mr. Dawson, I'll get my shawl. Within minutes, Tabitha found herself perched somewhat uncomfortably on Keller's horse, seated sideways in front of him as they rode out of Silverdale. She had rarely been on horseback, and never like this, with a virtual stranger's arms around her to hold the reins. The impropriety of it made her cheeks burn, but there was no alternative if she wanted to see this ranch before making her decision. Are you comfortable? Keller asked, his voice close to her ear. As much as can be expected, she replied stiffly, trying to maintain some distance despite their intimate position. The journey took most of the day, with a brief stop at midday to rest the horse and eat some jerky and biscuits that Keller had in his saddlebags. As they rode, the landscape changed from the rocky terrain around Silverdale to more open country with rolling hills and patches of pine forest. There it is, Keller said finally, pointing to a distant valley. Dawson Ranch. As they drew closer, Tabitha could make out a modest cabin nestled against a hillside, a barn and a corral. A clear creek wound through the property, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the lush grass. It was beautiful in a rugged, untamed way, nothing like the dusty mining town she'd called home. Keller helped her dismount when they reached the cabin, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Tabitha stepped away quickly, not wanting to acknowledge the strange flutter in her stomach at his touch. It's not much, he said, gesturing to the cabin, but it's solid. I built it myself. Inside, the cabin was indeed rustic but surprisingly well constructed. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors that presumably led to bedrooms. You'd have this room, Keller said, opening one of the doors to reveal a small but clean bedroom with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the creek. I'll take the other room when I'm here, which won't be often until my contract ends. Tabitha walked slowly around the cabin, trying to imagine living here. It was remote, yes, but there was something peaceful about it too, and it offered what she needed most, a roof over her head and honest work. The nearest town is Preston, about 10 miles south, Keller explained. Not much more than a trading post, general store, and saloon, but they get supplies regularly from the larger settlements. And what exactly would my duties be? Tabitha asked, running her hand along the rough-hewn table that dominated the main room, keeping the books, as I mentioned. Ordering supplies, supervising the ranch hands I plan to hire 2 to start with, and generally making sure the place doesn't fall apart while I'm finishing my contract with Whitmore. That's a lot of responsibility to entrust to someone you've just met. Keller leaned against the doorframe, studying her. I'm a good judge of character, Miss Sullivan. You strike me as someone who values hard work and honesty. Those are rare qualities, especially out here. Tabitha wasn't sure how to respond to that. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the land. It was beautiful in a wild sort of way, the kind of beauty her father would have appreciated. I'll need references, Keller said suddenly. For the ranch hands, do you know anyone reliable from Silverdale who might be looking for work? The question caught her off guard. You're asking my opinion already? If you decide to take the position, yes. And even if you don't, I'd value the recommendation. Tabitha thought for a moment. Thomas Jenkins is skilled with livestock. He worked at the livery before the mine closed. And his son Daniel is young but strong and willing to learn. Keller nodded. Good to know. Now, Miss Sullivan, I don't mean to rush you, but we should head back to Silverdale if you're to have time to consider my offer and make arrangements. The ride back was quieter, with Tabitha lost in thought. The offer was unexpected and not without risk, but it was also the most promising option she'd encountered since the mine's closure. By the time they reached Silverdale, twilight was falling, casting long shadows across the deserted Main Street. "I'll come by tomorrow morning for your answer," Keller said as he helped her down from the horse outside her cabin. "If you decide to accept, we can draw up a proper contract then." Tabitha nodded, suddenly exhausted from the long day and the weight of the decision before her. "Thank you for showing me the ranch, Mr. Dawson." "Keller, please," he said, his voice softer than it had been all day. "If we're to work together, we should dispense with formalities." "Very well." Keller? His name felt strange on her lips. "Good night." Inside her cabin, Tabitha lit a lamp and sank into her father's old rocking chair. The prospect of leaving the only home she'd known as an adult filled her with sadness, but the alternative, having no home at all, was unthinkable. Keller Dawson seemed honest enough, and his offer was more than fair. Still, there was something unsettling about placing her future in the hands of a man she'd just met. No matter how straightforward he appeared to be, she thought of the ranch, Dawson Ranch, he'd called it. The name had a certain ring to it. The land was beautiful, the cabin sturdy if simple. It would be hard work, but she was no stranger to that. And it would be temporary just until she could save enough money to establish herself somewhere more permanent. By the time she finally went to bed, Tabitha had made her decision. When Keller Dawson returned in the morning, she would accept his offer. True to his word, Keller arrived shortly after dawn, his horse laden with supplies. Tabitha had risen early, packing her few possessions and preparing for what would come next. "Good morning, Miss Sullivan," he greeted her, dismounting. "Have you reached a decision?" "I have," she replied, stepping out onto the small porch. "I accept your offer, Mr. Dawson Keller. But I have conditions of my own to add to the contract." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I expected nothing less. Let's hear them." "First, I want it clearly stated that my employment is guaranteed for 1 year with room and board included. Second, I want a fair wage paid monthly. Third, I am to have complete authority over the ranch operations in your absence, including hiring and firing if necessary." Keller nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Those are reasonable terms. I'd add only that major expenditures or changes to the operation would require my approval." "Agreed," Tabitha said. She hesitated before adding, "and I want it understood that this is a business arrangement only." Keller's eyes met hers, his gaze steady. "Of course, Miss Sullivan, I assure you my intentions are entirely honorable." They spent the next hour drafting a contract on a sheet of paper Tabitha produced from her ledger. The terms were clear and fair, and when they both signed it, Tabitha felt a small measure of relief wash over her. At least now she had some security, some plan for the immediate future. "I've spoken with Thomas Jenkins," Keller said as they finished. "He and his son Daniel are willing to come work at the ranch. They can be ready to leave tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Tabitha echoed, surprised at how quickly everything was moving. "No sense in waiting until the last minute," Keller pointed out. "Besides, there's much to be done at the ranch before winter sets in." Tabitha nodded, recognizing the practicality of his suggestion. "Very well, I'll be ready." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as Tabitha sorted through her possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. Most of her father's mining equipment would have to stay. It was too heavy and had no use on a cattle ranch. But his books, her mother's china, and the family Bible were carefully wrapped and packed. As evening fell, a knock at the door revealed Thomas Jenkins and his son Daniel, both looking somewhat sheepish. "Evening, Miss Sullivan," Thomas said, hat in hand. "We heard from Mr. Dawson about the position at his ranch. Wanted to thank you for the recommendation." "You're both hard workers," Tabitha replied simply. "The ranch will be better for having you there." Daniel, barely 19, shifted from foot to foot. "Pa says you'll be the one giving us orders until Mr. Dawson moves to the ranch permanent-like." "That's right," Tabitha confirmed, curious about the young man's reaction. "Just wanted to say we don't have no problem with that," Thomas added hastily. Not every man would, you understand, taking orders from a woman, but we know you from the mine, know you're fair and smart. Tabitha felt a wave of gratitude toward these men who had worked alongside her father years ago. Thank you, Thomas, that means a great deal to me. After they left, Tabitha continued packing, her mind occupied with thoughts of what lay ahead. The ranch was remote, the work would be demanding, and she would be essentially alone except for Thomas, Daniel, and Keller's occasional visits. But it was a chance more than she'd had yesterday. Morning came all too soon. Keller arrived with a wagon he'd borrowed from a departing family, Thomas and Daniel following with their own meager possessions loaded on a cart pulled by Thomas's mule. Tabitha stood on the porch of her cabin one last time, a lump in her throat as she surveyed the only home she'd known since childhood. "Ready?" Keller asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. "As I'll ever be," Tabitha replied, squaring her shoulders. With Thomas and Daniel's help, they loaded Tabitha's belongings onto the wagon. It didn't take long her life fit into disappointingly few crates and bundles. With one last look at the cabin, Tabitha climbed onto the wagon seat next to Keller, and they set off for Dawson Ranch. The journey seemed shorter this time, perhaps because Tabitha was now traveling toward something rather than away from it. By late afternoon, they reached the ranch, and Tabitha felt a strange sense of homecoming as the cabin came into view. "Thomas, Daniel, you can put your things in the bunkhouse for now," Keller directed, pointing to a small structure near the barn. "We'll get everything properly organized tomorrow." As the men unloaded their belongings, Keller helped Tabitha carry her things into the cabin. "I had a woman from Preston come out and give the place a good cleaning last week," he explained as they entered. "Wanted it to be presentable if you agreed to come." The gesture touched Tabitha more than she cared to admit. "Thank you, that was thoughtful." They worked together to bring in her possessions, with Keller insisting on handling the heavier items himself. As they arranged her books on a shelf in the main room, their hands brushed briefly, sending an unexpected jolt through Tabitha that she quickly dismissed as simple fatigue from the day's journey. "I'll need to head back to Whitmore's ranch tomorrow," Keller said as they finished. "But I've left detailed instructions about the cattle and what needs to be done over the next few weeks. I've also arranged credit for you at the general store in Preston for any supplies you might need." Tabitha nodded, suddenly aware of how alone she would be once he left. It was what she had agreed to, of course, but the reality of it was only now sinking in. "When will you return?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "In about 2 weeks, if all goes well. I need to check on the new cattle before they're delivered next month." He hesitated, then added, "Will you be all right here?" "Of course," Tabitha said firmly. "I've managed on my own for years." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I don't doubt it, Miss Sullivan." That night, after a simple meal shared with Thomas and Daniel, Tabitha retired to her new room. The bed was narrower than she was used to, the mattress firmer. But as she lay in the darkness listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the pines, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. This place wasn't home, not yet, but perhaps it could be, at least for a time. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a hint of the approaching autumn in the air. Tabitha rose early and was already preparing breakfast when Thomas and Daniel arrived at the cabin, looking somewhat uncertain about the new arrangement. "Figured we'd see what needs doing today, Miss Sullivan," Thomas said, accepting a cup of coffee with a grateful nod. "Mr. Dawson left instructions," Tabitha replied, retrieving a folded paper from the shelf. "He wants the north pasture fence repaired and the cattle moved there by the end of the week." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Begging your pardon, miss, but have you ever worked with cattle before?" "No," Tabitha admitted, "but I'm a quick learner, and I trust you both know what you're doing." Thomas nodded. "Been working with livestock most of my life. We'll show you what's what." After breakfast, Keller joined them, going over his plans for the ranch in more detail before preparing to depart. As he mounted his horse, he turned to Tabitha one last time. "Remember, if there's any trouble, Preston isn't far. The sheriff there, Jim Collins, is a good man. And I'll be back as soon as I can." Tabitha nodded, oddly touched by his concern. "We'll be fine, Mr. Dawson. Safe travels." She watched as he rode away, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape, and felt a momentary pang of doubt. What had she gotten herself into, agreeing to manage a ranch she knew nothing about, dependent on the word of a man she barely knew? But there was no time for second thoughts. There was work to be done, and Tabitha Sullivan had never been one to shy away from hard work. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and oddly satisfying. Each morning, Tabitha rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Thomas and Daniel before they headed out to tend the cattle. She spent her mornings setting up a proper bookkeeping system for the ranch, carefully recording every expenditure and planning for future needs. In the afternoons, she often joined the men in their work, determined to learn everything she could about cattle ranching. Her hands, once soft from indoor work at the mine office, soon grew calloused. Her fair skin tanned under the relentless sun, and muscles she didn't know she had ached at the end of each day. But there was a freedom in this new life that she hadn't expected. The land itself seemed to speak to her in quiet moments, the whisper of the creek, the rustle of pine needles in the breeze, the distant call of hawks circling overhead. It was nothing like the constant noise and dust of the mining town, and Tabitha found herself appreciating the difference more each day. A week after Keller's departure, Tabitha made her first trip to Preston. The small trading post was a far cry from even Silverdale, consisting of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of dwellings. But the storekeeper, a round-faced man named Henry Baker, greeted her warmly when she presented Keller's letter of credit. "Ah, so you're the lady managing Dawson's spread," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Heard about that. Unusual arrangement, if you don't mind my saying so." "Mr. Dawson values competence, Mr. Baker," Tabitha replied evenly. "Gender is irrelevant," Baker chuckled. "Well said, Miss Sullivan. Now, what can I get for you today?" Tabitha presented her carefully prepared list, and as Baker gathered the items, she browsed the small store. It was while examining a shelf of canned goods that she overheard a conversation between two men near the door. "Dawson's got nerve, I'll give him that," one was saying. "Buying that land right out from under Whitmore's nose. Whitmore can't touch him as long as he's still working his contract," the other replied. "Smart move, getting that Sullivan woman to run the place while he's still at the main ranch. Keeps his hands clean. Still, playing both sides is dangerous. Whitmore won't take kindly to competition in these parts, especially from his own foreman." Tabitha froze, her hand still reaching for a can of peaches. What were they talking about? Keller had said he purchased the land 6 months ago and that he was here on Whitmore's behalf to assess the property in Silverdale. "Miss Sullivan," Baker called, "I've got your order ready." Forcing a smile, Tabitha turned from the shelf. "Thank you, Mr. Baker. Please add these peaches as well." On the ride back to the ranch, Tabitha couldn't stop thinking about what she'd overheard. Had Keller lied to her? Was there something about the ranch that he hadn't disclosed? The questions tumbled through her mind, leaving her uneasy and uncertain. Thomas and Daniel were mending a corral fence when she returned, and they helped her unload the supplies from the wagon she'd borrowed. "Everything all right, Miss Sullivan?" Thomas asked, noticing her distracted expression. "You seem troubled." Tabitha hesitated, then decided there was no harm in asking. "Thomas, what do you know about Mr. Dawson's arrangement with Whitmore?" Thomas scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Not much, miss, just that he's been Whitmore's foreman for several years. Why do you ask?" "I overheard something in town about Mr. Dawson buying this land out from under Whitmore's nose. It made it sound as if there might be some conflict between them." Daniel snorted. "Wouldn't surprise me none. Whitmore's known for being hard to work for, treats his men poorly from what I hear." "But Mr. Dawson told me he was here on Whitmore's behalf," Tabitha persisted. To assess the property in Silverdale, Thomas and Daniel exchanged a look that Tabitha couldn't quite interpret. Could be he's playing both sides, Thomas suggested cautiously. It's not uncommon out here, miss. A man does what he must to get ahead. The explanation didn't sit well with Tabitha, but she nodded, not wanting to pursue the matter further with the men. She would ask Keller directly when he returned. If he was being dishonest with her, she needed to know her future depended on the security of this position. As the days passed, Tabitha threw herself into the work of the ranch, determined not to dwell on her concerns until she could address them with Keller. She rode out with Thomas to check on the cattle, learning to recognize signs of illness or distress. She helped Daniel repair the roof of the bunkhouse when a strong wind damaged it. And each evening, she meticulously updated the ranch ledger, noting every development and expenditure. 14 days after his departure, just as he'd promised, Keller returned. Tabitha was in the corral, attempting to saddle a particularly stubborn mare when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw Keller riding toward the ranch, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Something fluttered in her chest at the sight of him. Relief, she told herself firmly. Relief that the owner of the ranch had returned safely, nothing more. "Miss Sullivan," Keller called as he dismounted, a smile spreading across his face. "I didn't expect to find you wrangling horses." Tabitha brushed a strand of hair from her face, suddenly conscious of her appearance. 2 weeks of ranch work had left her usual neat bun in disarray, and her dress was dusty and stained. "Someone has to do it," she replied, striving for a casual tone. "Thomas is checking the north pasture and Daniel is repairing the chicken coop." Keller approached the corral, his eyes taking in the changes around the ranch: the repaired roof, the freshly painted barn door, the new chicken coop under construction. "You've been busy," he observed. "The place looks better than when I left." "We've tried to make improvements where we could," Tabitha said, finally managing to secure the saddle on the mare. "There's still much to be done before winter." Keller nodded, his expression turning more serious. "I need to speak with you about something important, Miss Sullivan. Preferably in private." The flutter in Tabitha's chest turned to a knot of apprehension. Was he going to confirm what she had overheard in Preston? Or worse, had he changed his mind about their arrangement? "Of course," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Let me just finish with this horse, and I'll meet you at the cabin." Keller nodded and led his own horse toward the barn, leaving Tabitha to wonder what news he brought. By the time she reached the cabin, her nerves were taut with anticipation. She found Keller standing by the fireplace, examining a daguerreotype of her parents that she had placed on the mantel. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "You've made this place feel like a home," he said quietly. "I've tried to make it comfortable," Tabitha replied, remaining near the door. "You wanted to speak with me?" Keller gestured to the table. "Please sit down, this may take some explaining." Tabitha did as he asked, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from betraying her nervousness. Keller sat across from her, his hat placed carefully on the table between them. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, Miss Sullivan," he began, his blue eyes meeting hers directly, "and for that I apologize." Tabitha felt her heart sink. "About your relationship with Mr. Whitmore." Surprise flashed across Keller's face. "You know, I overheard something in Preston," Tabitha admitted. "Something about you buying this land out from under Whitmore's nose. Are you in some kind of conflict with him?" "Is this ranch in jeopardy?" Keller sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated. Yes, I am still Whitmore's foreman, and yes, I am here on his behalf to assess the Silverdale property. But this ranch," he gestured around them, "was never part of his holdings. I purchased it legitimately from the previous owner, a man named James Foster, who was looking to return east after his wife died." "Then why would someone say you bought it from under Whitmore's nose?" "Because Whitmore had been trying to buy this land for years. Foster refused to sell to him, didn't like his methods or his treatment of the land. When I expressed interest, Foster was willing to sell to me, partly because I promised to maintain the ranch as it was, not strip it for quick profit as Whitmore would have done. Tabitha absorbed this information, trying to determine if it made sense. So you're not being dishonest with Whitmore. He knows you own this ranch, Keller hesitated. He knows I purchased property in the area. He doesn't know exactly where, and he doesn't know I'm establishing my own operation while still working for him. That would be frowned upon. So you are playing both sides, Tabitha said, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. I'm fulfilling my contract, Keller countered. I owe Whitmore 3 more months of work, and he'll get every day of it. But I don't owe him my future, Miss Sullivan. I've worked too hard and too long to pass up an opportunity like this ranch. And what happens when he finds out? Will he retaliate? Will this ranch and my position be at risk? Keller leaned forward, his expression intense. I won't let that happen. Once my contract ends, I'll be free to do as I please. Whitmore may not like it, but there's nothing he can legally do to stop me from running my own ranch. Tabitha wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded slowly. Is there anything else you haven't told me? Anything else I should know? A shadow passed over Keller's face. There is one other matter. The cattle I mentioned, the ones being delivered next month, they're coming from Texas. My brother Kyle is bringing them. I don't understand. Why is that a problem? Because Texas cattle sometimes carry a fever that can be deadly to local herds. It doesn't affect the Texas Longhorns, but it can wipe out entire herds of other breeds. Many ranchers in these parts are hostile to Texas cattle for that reason. Tabitha felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying your cattle could destroy the other ranches in the area? No, Keller said quickly. The cattle my brother is bringing have been carefully selected and checked. They're healthy. But the fear is real, and the prejudice against Texas herds is strong. It's another reason Whitmore might object to my operation. Tabitha sat back in her chair, trying to process everything Keller had told her. On one hand, his explanations made sense. On the other, he had admitted to withholding information from her, which made her wonder what else he might not be disclosing. I understand if this changes things for you, Keller said quietly. If you want to reconsider our arrangement, no, Tabitha interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. I made a commitment and I'll honor it, but I expect complete honesty from you going forward, Mr. Dawson. No more surprises. Relief washed over Keller's face. You have my word, Miss Sullivan. The tension between them eased somewhat as they moved on to discussing the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Keller was impressed with the improvements Tabitha had initiated and the careful records she had kept. As they talked, Tabitha found herself relaxing in his presence, her earlier concerns not forgotten but set aside for the moment. You've done remarkably well, Keller said as they concluded their discussion. Better than I could have hoped. Thomas and Daniel have been invaluable, Tabitha acknowledged. They know far more about ranching than I do. But they follow your lead, Keller pointed out. That speaks to your ability to command respect, Miss Sullivan. It's a rare quality. Tabitha felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. How long will you stay this time? Just 3 days. I need to get back to Whitmore's ranch to prepare for the fall roundup, but I'll return when the Texas cattle arrive next month. 3 days. Tabitha tried to ignore the pang of disappointment she felt. I understand. We'll continue as we have been. As promised, Keller stayed for 3 days, working alongside Thomas and Daniel from dawn till dusk, making repairs and improvements to the ranch that required a stronger back than either of the other men possessed. In the evenings, he and Tabitha would sit at the cabin table, reviewing her accounts and planning for the coming months. Despite her initial reservations about his honesty, Tabitha found herself drawn to Keller's quiet competence and obvious passion for the land. He spoke of his plans for the ranch with a reverence that reminded her of her father, who had always said that land was the only thing worth having, the only thing that lasted. On the evening before his departure, as they sat before the fire after a long day's work, Keller turned to Tabitha with an unusually serious expression. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, Miss Sullivan. Tabitha looked up from her mending, a half-darned sock forgotten in her hands. Yes, I noticed you keep your father's mining tools, even though they must have been difficult to transport and have no use here. It wasn't what Tabitha had expected him to say, and she hesitated before responding. They were his livelihood for most of his life. I couldn't bear to leave them behind, Keller nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Family is important to you. It was, Tabitha corrected gently. My father was all I had after my mother died when I was 12. Now there's no one. No one, Keller pressed, no relatives elsewhere. No suitor left behind in Silverdale? Tabitha shook her head, wondering at his curiosity. No relatives except a distant cousin in Boston whom I've never met, and no suitor. There were few eligible men in Silverdale, and those who were available showed little interest in a bookkeeper with no dowry. Their loss, Keller said quietly, his gaze returning to the fire. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the flames and the occasional pop of a log. What about you? Tabitha finally asked. You mentioned a brother in Texas. Do you have other family? A shadow crossed Keller's face. My parents died in a cholera outbreak when I was 16. Kyle is 10 years older than me. He raised me after they were gone. We worked cattle drives together until I took the position with Whitmore 5 years ago. And no wife. Tabitha asked before she could stop herself. No, attachments? Keller's eyes met hers, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. No, Miss Sullivan, no wife or attachments. Ranch life doesn't lend itself well to courting. Tabitha nodded, returning her attention to her mending to hide the inexplicable blush that warmed her cheeks. No, I suppose it doesn't. The next morning, Tabitha rose early to prepare a hearty breakfast before Keller's departure. As they ate with Thomas and Daniel, Keller outlined the tasks that needed to be completed before his return. The cattle should arrive around the 15th of next month, he explained. I'll be here a few days before to prepare. Kyle will likely stay for a week or so to help us get them settled before he heads back to Texas. We'll be ready, Thomas assured him, helping himself to more biscuits. Miss Sullivan's got us working from sunup to sundown. As it should be, Keller replied with a smile in Tabitha's direction. After breakfast, Tabitha walked with Keller to where his horse was saddled and waiting. The morning was crisp, with a hint of frost on the grass, a reminder that winter wasn't far off. Thank you, Keller said suddenly, turning to face her, for everything you've done here. For taking a chance on this place and on me. Tabitha was momentarily at a loss for words. I should be thanking you, she finally said. You offered me a position when I had nowhere else to go. We've helped each other then, Keller said, his eyes searching her face as if committing it to memory. I'll return as soon as I can. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Tabitha standing by the corral, watching until he disappeared from view. It was only as she turned back toward the cabin that she realized how much she would miss his presence in the coming weeks. The days following Keller's departure fell into a now familiar rhythm. Tabitha continued to learn and grow more confident in her role, with Thomas and Daniel providing guidance when needed. The ranch began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a home, especially as Tabitha added small touches to the cabin curtains she sewed from fabric purchased in Preston, a braided rug before the fireplace, her father's books arranged on a shelf Keller had built. As the date of the cattle delivery approached, Tabitha ensured that everything was ready. The pastures were prepared, the barn stocked with feed for the coming winter, the corral reinforced to hold the new arrivals. She rode to Preston herself to arrange for additional supplies, ignoring the curious stares of the townspeople who were still adjusting to the idea of a woman running Dawson Ranch. It was during this trip that she encountered Sheriff Jim Collins for the first time. A tall, weathered man with graying hair at his temples, he approached her as she was loading supplies into her wagon. Miss Sullivan, I presume, he said, tipping his hat. Tabitha straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. Yes, Sheriff, how may I help you? Just wanted to introduce myself. Keller Dawson spoke highly of you when he was in town last month. Said you're managing his ranch while he finishes his contract with Whitmore. That's correct, Tabitha replied, wondering why the sheriff felt the need to confirm this information. Collins studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. It's an unusual arrangement. Some folks hereabouts are talking. People will always talk, Sheriff, Tabitha said evenly. Especially when a woman does something unexpected. A smile creased the corners of Collins' eyes. True enough. Just wanted you to know that if you need anything, any trouble out at the ranch, my door is always open. Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate that. As Collins walked away, Tabitha couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his visit than simple courtesy. Had someone expressed concerns about her presence at the ranch? Or was there something else, perhaps something related to Keller's complicated relationship with Whitmore, that had prompted the sheriff's interest? She pushed these thoughts aside as she returned to the ranch, focusing instead on the immediate tasks at hand. But that night, as she sat alone at the table reviewing the ledger, Tabitha found her mind returning to Keller and the mysteries that seemed to surround him. She had accepted his explanations about Whitmore and the Texas cattle, but there was still something about the situation that didn't quite add up. 3 days before the cattle were due to arrive, Keller returned to the ranch as promised. This time, he wasn't alone. A tall, broad-shouldered man with the same blue eyes rode beside him, along with 2 younger men who were clearly experienced cowhands. Miss Sullivan, Keller called as they approached the cabin where Tabitha stood waiting. Allow me to introduce my brother, Kyle Dawson, and our friends Sam Fletcher and Will Tucker. They've come to help with the cattle. Tabitha nodded in greeting as the men dismounted. Kyle Dawson approached her first, removing his hat to reveal hair several shades lighter than Keller's but with the same tendency to curl. Miss Sullivan, he said, his Texas drawl more pronounced than his brother's. Keller's told me a great deal about you. Said you're a natural at ranch management. Your brother is too kind, Tabitha replied, feeling strangely self-conscious under Kyle's appraising gaze. Please, all of you, come inside. You must be tired after your journey. As they settled around the table with coffee and the stew Tabitha had prepared in anticipation of their arrival, Kyle regaled them with stories of their drive north with the cattle, which were currently being held in a temporary pasture a day's ride from the ranch. Finest longhorns you'll ever see, Kyle assured Tabitha. Handpicked from the best herds in Texas. And they're healthy, Tabitha asked, remembering Keller's warning about Texas fever. As healthy as horses, Kyle confirmed. We took every precaution, made sure they weren't carrying any ticks that might spread disease. Keller, who had been quietly observing the conversation, nodded in agreement. Kyle knows what he's doing, Miss Sullivan. These cattle will form the foundation of a strong herd. As the evening progressed, Tabitha found herself drawn into the easy camaraderie of the Dawson brothers and their friends. There was an obvious bond between Keller and Kyle, evident in their shared glances and the way they finished each other's sentences. It made Tabitha think of her own solitary existence and the family she had lost. The next day was a flurry of activity as they made final preparations for the cattle's arrival. Keller and Kyle rode out with Thomas to check the pastures one last time, while Tabitha worked with Daniel, Sam, and Will to ensure the barn and corral were ready. It was late afternoon when Keller and Kyle returned, their expressions grim. What's wrong? Tabitha asked, immediately sensing that something had happened. Whitmore, Keller said, dismounting with a weariness that hadn't been present that morning. He knows about the cattle. Someone in Preston must have talked. Is that a problem? Tabitha asked, though she already suspected the answer. Kyle snorted. It's a problem when he sends men to threaten us, telling us to turn the herd around and head back to Texas. Tabitha felt a chill run down her spine. He threatened you, physically? Not in so many words, Keller admitted, but the message was clear. He doesn't want Texas longhorns anywhere near his property. Claiming they'll bring disease, Kyle added, his voice tight with anger. It's just an excuse. He doesn't want competition, plain and simple. Tabitha looked between the brothers, seeing the same determination in both their faces. "What will you do?" "Bring the cattle home as planned," Keller said firmly. "This is my land, legally purchased and paid for. Whitmore has no say in what livestock I choose to raise." "But if he's threatened you once, he might do worse," Tabitha pointed out, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Keller's eyes met hers, his expression softening slightly. "Are you concerned for my safety, Miss Sullivan?" "I'm concerned for all our safety," Tabitha replied, though she could feel a blush rising to her cheeks. "And for the future of this ranch." Kyle looked between them, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, I for one am not afraid of Edward Whitmore or his hired guns. We've faced worse on the trail." Tabitha spent a restless night, her mind filled with worries about Whitmore and what his opposition might mean for the ranch and for her position there. If there was real trouble, would Keller abandon the ranch? Would he be forced to? And where would that leave her? Morning brought no answers, only the news that Keller, Kyle, and the others were riding out to bring the cattle home. They would be gone overnight, returning the following day with the herd. "Be vigilant while we're gone," Keller advised Tabitha before they departed. "Keep Thomas and Daniel close by. If anyone comes to the ranch, anyone at all, send one of them to fetch Sheriff Collins immediately." "Do you really think Whitmore would try something while you're away?" Tabitha asked, unable to keep the anxiety from her voice. "I don't know," Keller admitted. "But I'd rather be cautious than sorry." As the men rode away, Tabitha stood on the porch, watching until they disappeared from view. The ranch seemed suddenly larger and more isolated without Keller's reassuring presence. The day passed without incident, though Tabitha jumped at every unexpected sound. Thomas and Daniel stayed close to the cabin, working on tasks that kept them within shouting distance. By nightfall, Tabitha's nerves were stretched thin, and she found herself sitting at the kitchen table with her father's old revolver laid out before her, a precaution she had never before felt necessary. She was just preparing for bed when the sound of approaching horses broke the silence. Heart pounding, Tabitha grabbed the revolver and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Thomas and Daniel were already outside, lanterns raised to illuminate the visitors. Relief washed over her when she recognized Sheriff Collins leading a small group of men toward the cabin. Setting the revolver aside, Tabitha hurried to the door. "Evening, Miss Sullivan," Collins called as he dismounted. "Sorry to disturb you so late." "Not at all, Sheriff. Is something wrong?" Collins approached the porch, his expression serious. "Got word that there might be trouble heading this way. Thought I'd ride out and make sure everything's all right." Tabitha glanced at the men who had accompanied him, 4 deputies, all armed and looking grimly determined. "Trouble from Whitmore." "Can't say for certain," Collins replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. "But I know he's not happy about the Texas cattle coming to Dawson's ranch. Where is Keller, by the way?" "He and his brother rode out this morning to bring the cattle home," Tabitha explained. "They should return tomorrow." Collins nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then we'll just make ourselves comfortable until they do. If you don't mind, Miss Sullivan, my men and I will keep watch tonight, just to be safe." "Of course," Tabitha said, relief evident in her voice. "There's coffee on the stove, and I can prepare something for you to eat." "Much obliged," Collins replied, signaling to his deputies to dismount. With the sheriff and his men stationed around the property, Tabitha finally felt secure enough to retire for the night, though sleep remained elusive. She couldn't help but wonder what Keller and Kyle might be riding into when they returned with the cattle. If Whitmore was desperate enough to try something, would the sheriff's presence be enough to deter him? Morning dawned clear and cool, with no sign of trouble. Tabitha rose early to prepare breakfast for Collins and his men, who reported a quiet night with no disturbances. As they ate, the sheriff explained that he had received a warning from one of Whitmore's former hands, who had heard plans being discussed to discourage the arrival of the Texas cattle. "Whitmore's been the biggest rancher in these parts for years," Collins explained. He doesn't take kindly to competition, especially from someone who used to work for him. But surely he wouldn't resort to violence. Tabitha asked, unable to believe that a business dispute could escalate so dramatically. Colin's expression was grim. Wouldn't be the first time. There have been incidents in the past, nothing that could be proven, mind you, but enough to make me take this threat seriously. The hours seemed to crawl by as they waited for Keller and the others to return. Tabitha tried to keep busy with chores around the cabin, but her mind was fixated on the ridge to the south, where the men would first appear when they returned with the cattle. It was mid-afternoon when Thomas, who had been keeping watch, called out that riders were approaching. Tabitha rushed to join him, her heart pounding with anticipation and relief. But as the figures came into view, she realized it was only Keller and Kyle, no cattle, and no sign of Sam or Will. Sheriff Collins stepped forward as the brothers rode into the yard, their expressions grim and their clothes covered in dust. "Dawson," Collins greeted them. "Where are your cattle?" Keller dismounted, his movements stiff as if he was in pain. "Scattered. Whitmore's men attacked our camp last night, stampeded the herd." "Are you hurt?" Tabitha asked, rushing forward before she could stop herself. Keller shook his head, though she could see a darkening bruise on his jaw. "Nothing serious. Kyle got the worst of it, took a blow to the ribs." Kyle dismounted more slowly, one arm pressed against his side. "I'll live," he said, though his breathing was labored. "Can't say the same for some of Whitmore's men. Sam and Will are tracking the cattle, trying to round up as many as they can." Colin's expression darkened. "You're saying Whitmore's men attacked you directly, not just the cattle, came at us in the night," Keller confirmed. 6 of them, armed, said they were delivering a message from Whitmore: no Texas cattle allowed in these parts. "And you defended yourselves," Collins surmised. Kyle gave a grim smile. "Let's just say they didn't expect us to be ready for them. 2 ran off, 2 are nursing some serious hurts, and 2 might need a doctor worse than I do." Tabitha felt a chill run down her spine at the casual way Kyle described what must have been a violent encounter. This was a side of the West she had heard about but never experienced directly: the lawlessness, the resort to violence to settle disputes. "I need to ride out there," Collins said, already turning toward his horse. "See for myself what happened. My deputies will stay here in case Whitmore decides to try again." As Collins and 2 of his men rode out to investigate, Tabitha helped Kyle into the cabin while Thomas took charge of the horses. Once inside, she insisted on examining Kyle's injuries, which proved to be painful but not life-threatening: 2 cracked ribs and a collection of bruises. "You're lucky," she told him as she wrapped his ribs with strips of clean cloth. "Broken ribs can puncture a lung if you're not careful." "Been hurt worse," Kyle said with a grimace. "Though I appreciate your nursing skills, Miss Sullivan." When she had finished with Kyle, Tabitha turned her attention to Keller, who had been watching silently from across the room. "Your turn," she said, gesturing to the chair Kyle had vacated. "I'm fine," Keller protested. "Just some bruises." "Let me be the judge of that," Tabitha insisted, her tone brooking no argument. With a sigh, Keller sat down, allowing Tabitha to examine the cut on his jaw and the bruises on his knuckles. As she gently cleaned the cut, she was acutely aware of his eyes on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Thank you," he said quietly when she had finished, "for everything." Tabitha stepped back, suddenly self-conscious. "It's nothing. I'm just glad you both returned safely." Kyle, who had been watching their interaction with interest, cleared his throat. "Think I'll go check on the horses," he said, rising carefully from his chair. "Give you 2 some privacy." "That's not necessary," Tabitha began, but Kyle was already out the door, a knowing smile on his face despite his obvious discomfort. Left alone with Keller, Tabitha busied herself putting away the medical supplies, avoiding his gaze. The cabin seemed suddenly smaller, the air between them charged with something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Miss Sullivan," Keller said finally, his voice softer than usual. "Tabitha, there's something I need to say." The use of her first name startled her into looking up, meeting his eyes directly. Yes. Keller ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. What happened last night, the attack, it's because of me, because of my decisions. I put you and everyone else here in danger by bringing those cattle to this ranch. You couldn't have known Whitmore would react so violently, Tabitha argued. I should have, Keller countered. I worked for him long enough to know what he's capable of. I wanted this ranch to succeed so badly. I wanted to prove I could build something of my own. The vulnerability in his admission touched Tabitha deeply. And you will, she said firmly. This setback doesn't change that, doesn't it? Keller's expression was bleak. Without those cattle, how will the ranch survive the winter? How will I pay you? And Thomas and Daniel will find a way, Tabitha insisted. Sam and Will might recover some of the herd, and there are other options, other breeds of cattle that won't provoke Whitmore's ire. Keller looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes. Most women would be packing their belongings by now, demanding to be taken to the nearest town. I'm not most women, Tabitha replied simply. A smile slowly spread across Keller's face, transforming his tired features. No, he agreed softly. You're not. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Tabitha was the first to look away, her pulse racing with emotions she wasn't ready to name. You should rest, she said, moving toward the door. I'll check on Kyle and see about preparing something to eat. Outside, Tabitha leaned against the cabin wall, taking deep breaths to steady herself. What was happening to her? This arrangement with Keller was meant to be purely professional, a business agreement between employer and employee. Yet she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her whenever he looked at her that way, or the concern that had nearly overwhelmed her when she'd seen him ride in injured. She was still trying to collect her thoughts when Kyle approached, moving carefully to avoid jarring his injured ribs. He cares for you, you know, Kyle said without preamble, more than he's willing to admit, even to himself. Tabitha felt her cheeks flush. Mr. Dawson, Kyle, I don't think my brother is stubborn, Kyle continued as if she hadn't spoken. Always has been, but he's also the best man I know. Loyal to a fault, honest as the day is long, and determined to build something that will last. I don't doubt any of that, Tabitha replied carefully. Kyle studied her face. And you, what are your feelings for him? The directness of the question took Tabitha aback. I respect him greatly. And I'm grateful for the opportunity he's given me. Respect and gratitude, Kyle echoed with a small smile. Is that all? Before Tabitha could formulate a response, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Sheriff Collins was returning, and behind him came Sam and Will, driving a small group of cattle, perhaps 20 head in all. It's not much, Kyle observed, his expression somber, but it's a start. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as they settled the recovered cattle and assessed their situation. Sheriff Collins, after investigating the attack, had arrested 2 of Whitmore's men who were still at the scene, injured and unable to flee. The evidence was clear enough that even Whitmore couldn't protect them, and Collins was confident they would face charges. As for Whitmore himself, the sheriff had paid him a visit, making it clear that any further interference with Dawson Ranch would result in serious legal consequences. Whether the warning would be heeded remained to be seen, but for the moment at least, the immediate threat had passed. With Kyle's help, Keller reorganized his plans for the ranch. The 20 recovered cattle would be enough to get through the winter, and come spring, they would look to purchase more from local ranchers who didn't share Whitmore's prejudice against Texas Longhorns. It's a setback, Keller acknowledged to Tabitha as they reviewed the ranch accounts one evening, but not a disaster. The ranch will survive. Of course it will, Tabitha replied with the confidence that had become her hallmark in their conversations, and so will we. The "we" slipped out before she could catch it, and she saw Keller's eyes soften at the word. Yes, he agreed quietly. We will. Kyle and the others prepared to return to Texas a week after the incident. Despite the unfortunate circumstances of their visit, Tabitha had come to enjoy their company. especially Kyle's easy humor and the stories he shared of Keller's younger days. On the morning of their departure, Kyle took Tabitha aside while Keller was busy with last-minute instructions for Sam and Will. "Take care of him," Kyle said, nodding toward his brother. "He needs someone like you, someone who believes in him as much as he believes in this land." "I'm just his employee," Tabitha reminded him, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Kyle's smile was knowing. "For now, perhaps. But I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, and the way you look at him." Before Tabitha could formulate a response, Kyle had moved away to mount his horse, leaving her with her cheeks burning and her thoughts in turmoil. After the Texas men departed, the ranch settled into a quieter rhythm. With his contract at Whitmore's ranch terminated by mutual agreement, according to Keller, though Tabitha suspected it had been less amicable than he let on, Keller was now at Dawson Ranch full-time. He moved into the second bedroom in the cabin, an arrangement that raised eyebrows in Preston but which Tabitha defended as perfectly proper, given that Thomas and Daniel were also on the property, and the bunkhouse was too crude for Keller's permanent residence. As autumn deepened into winter, Tabitha found herself growing increasingly comfortable with Keller's constant presence. They developed a routine. Early mornings spent discussing the day's tasks over coffee, days filled with the never-ending work of the ranch, and evenings by the fire, where they would talk about everything from books to their hopes for the ranch's future. It was during one of these evening conversations, as the first snow of winter fell gently outside, that Keller brought up a subject Tabitha had been carefully avoiding. "Your contract will be up in 4 months," he said, his eyes on the fire rather than her face. "Have you given any thought to what you'll do afterward?" Tabitha's hands stilled in her lap, the mending she had been working on forgotten. "Not specifically, no. I've been focused on the present." "Understandable," Keller nodded, "but I thought, perhaps we should discuss it." "Is there something specific you wish to say?" Tabitha asked, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. Keller finally looked at her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "I'd like you to stay, Tabitha, beyond the terms of the contract." The use of her first name, which had become more frequent in recent weeks, sent a now familiar warmth through her. "In what capacity?" she asked, needing to be clear about what he was offering. Keller set aside the book he had been pretending to read and leaned forward, his expression earnest. "In whatever capacity you wish. As the ranch manager, certainly you've proven yourself more than capable, but also—" He hesitated, seeming to gather his courage, "also as more than that if you're willing." Tabitha held her breath, afraid to hope that he meant what she thought he did. "More." "I care for you, Tabitha," Keller said simply. "More than I expected to, more than I thought possible after such a short acquaintance. These past months, working alongside you, seeing your strength and determination, I find myself thinking about a future that includes more than just this ranch." "A future that includes me," Tabitha said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Keller confirmed, reaching across to take her hand in his, "if that's something you might want too." Tabitha looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt. "When you first offered me this position, I was desperate without options or hope for the future. I accepted because I had nowhere else to go. And now," Keller prompted when she paused, "now I stay because I want to," Tabitha continued, meeting his gaze. "Because I believe in what we're building here, because I care for you too, Keller, more than I ever thought possible." The smile that spread across Keller's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Then stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Stay not because you have to, but because you want to. Stay as my partner in all things the ranch and life." "Are you asking me to marry you, Keller Dawson?" Tabitha asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I am," Keller confirmed, sliding from his chair to kneel before her. "I know it's soon, and I know there are 100 reasons why you might say no. But I also know that what we've found here is rare and precious. I love you, Tabitha Sullivan, and I want to share my name and my land with you if you'll have me." Tears filled Tabitha's eyes as the full meaning of his words washed over her. From the moment the mine had closed, leaving her with nothing, to this moment being offered everything she could have dreamed of, a home, a purpose, and a man who loved her for exactly who she was. "Yes," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Yes, Keller, I'll marry you." He rose then, pulling her up with him, and for the first time his lips met hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. It was a moment. Tabitha knew she would remember for the rest of her life the crackling fire, the snow falling outside, and the overwhelming certainty that she had found where she belonged. They were married 2 weeks later in Preston, with Sheriff Collins officiating and Thomas, Daniel, and a few townspeople as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, but to Tabitha, it was perfect. She wore a new dress purchased from the general store, dark blue with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and carried a small bouquet of dried wildflowers that Keller had somehow procured despite the winter season. "Mrs. Dawson," Keller whispered as they rode back to the ranch afterward, his arm secure around her waist as they shared his horse. "How does it sound?" "Like home," Tabitha replied, leaning back against his chest. "Like exactly where I'm meant to be." The winter passed in a blur of happiness for the newlyweds. Despite the challenges of ranch life, frozen pipes, dwindling supplies, and the constant battle against the elements, Tabitha had never been happier. Each morning she woke beside Keller, their shared bed warm despite the frost on the windows, and each night they fell asleep in each other's arms, planning their future together. Spring brought new life to Dawson Ranch. The cattle Keller had managed to recover thrived, with several calves born healthy and strong. The pastures turned green with new grass, and Tabitha planted a small vegetable garden beside the cabin, determined to make the ranch as self-sufficient as possible. As promised, Keller purchased additional cattle from local ranchers, carefully building their herd. Word had spread about Whitmore's attack on the Texas cattle, and many in the area were sympathetic to the Dawsons' situation. Sheriff Collins made a point of stopping by regularly, partly to check on them and partly, Tabitha suspected, because he enjoyed her cooking. In May, nearly a year after the mine in Silverdale had closed, leaving Tabitha with nothing, Kyle returned from Texas with a wedding gift. 5 of the finest breeding heifers he could find, along with a bull that he swore would. Father calves strong enough to withstand anything, even Whitmore's stubbornness. The reunion was joyous, with Kyle expressing no surprise but great satisfaction at finding his brother and Tabitha married. "Told you so," he whispered to Tabitha as he embraced her in greeting. "Could see it from the start." That evening, as they sat around the fire after a celebratory dinner, Kyle raised his glass in a toast. "To the Dawsons," he said, his eyes warm with affection. "And to Dawson Ranch, may they both prosper for generations to come." "Speaking of generations," Keller said, his arm around Tabitha's shoulders, "we have some news of our own." Tabitha felt her cheeks warm as all eyes turned to her. She and Keller had only confirmed it the week before, and they had been waiting for Kyle's arrival to share their joy. "By this time next year," Keller continued, his voice filled with pride, "there will be another Dawson at the ranch." Kyle's whoop of delight echoed through the cabin, followed by congratulations from Thomas and Daniel, who had become like family over the past year. Later that night, as Tabitha lay in Keller's arms, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, she marveled at how completely her life had changed in the span of a year. "What are you thinking?" Keller asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "About how lucky I am," Tabitha replied honestly. "A year ago I had nothing, no home, no future, no hope. Now I have everything I could ever want." "We're the lucky ones," Keller corrected gently. "This land, this ranch, it was just empty space until you came. You made it a home, Tabitha. You made it worth fighting for." Tabitha turned in his arms to face him, though she could barely make out his features in the dim light. "Do you remember what you said when you first proposed, about sharing your name and your land with me?" "Of course," Keller murmured, his hand warm against her back. I never imagined then how much that would mean, Tabitha continued. Not just having a place to live, but truly belonging somewhere, belonging with someone. Keller's kiss was tender, filled with all the love and promise of their life together. Always, he whispered against her lips. You'll always belong here with me for as long as there's breath in my body. As summer bloomed across the ranch, Tabitha's condition became more apparent. Keller grew increasingly protective, insisting on hiring additional help so that she wouldn't overexert herself. Despite her protests that women had been having babies while working hard for centuries, Tabitha secretly appreciated his concern. In August, Kyle returned once more, this time with a surprise. Their long-estranged sister Catherine, who had been living in San Francisco for the past decade. The reunion of the Dawson siblings was emotional, and Tabitha was immediately drawn to her sister-in-law's independent spirit and quick wit. He's different with you, Catherine observed one afternoon as they sat on the porch, watching Keller and Kyle mend a fence in the distance. Happier, more at peace. I like to think we've been good for each other, Tabitha replied, one hand resting on her growing belly. Catherine smiled, her eyes so like her brother's warm with approval. It's more than that. You've given him roots, Tabitha, a sense of place and purpose that he's been searching for since our parents died. The baby arrived in late November, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes, and a strong set of lungs that announced his presence to the world with impressive vigor. They named him James, after Tabitha's father, with Thomas as his middle name in honor of the loyal ranch hand who had become like family. He's perfect, Keller whispered as he held his son for the first time, awe and love mingled in his expression. Absolutely perfect. As winter settled once more over Dawson Ranch, bringing with it the quiet contemplation of the season, Tabitha often found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this place. From the desperate young woman facing eviction from a dying mining town to the confident ranch mistress and mother she had become, it was a transformation she could never have imagined. One snowy evening, as little James slept peacefully in his cradle, and Keller sat beside her on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold as they watched the snowflakes dance in the lamplight, Tabitha voiced the thought that had been growing in her heart. I never thanked you properly, she said, her head resting against Keller's shoulder. For what? He asked, his arm tightening around her. For sharing your land and your name with me when I had nothing else in the world. Keller turned to look at her, his expression serious in the dim light. You had everything I needed, Tabitha, courage, determination, and a heart bigger than all of Wyoming. I may have offered you land and a name, but you gave me a home and a family. He placed a gentle kiss on her forehead. I'd say we're even. As they sat together, watching the snow transform their ranch into a winter wonderland, Tabitha knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just shelter from a storm, but the place where she truly belonged. From the ashes of loss and desperation had risen something beautiful and enduring, a love and a legacy that would sustain them through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. Dawson Ranch was more than land and livestock now. It was a home, built not just with timber and nails but with love, perseverance, and the shared dream of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. And as the years would unfold, bringing more children, more challenges, and more triumphs, that foundation would prove stronger than any force that might threaten it, as enduring as the land itself.